The East is often seen as something not to fear as much as the Wild West. The West holds danger, adventure, and beauty around every corner, something that every outdoorsman dreams of experiencing. But between you and me, I think that the East is just as wild as the West. My name is David. I'm an angler and a filmmaker. This is one of my best friends, Addison. He's an avid hiker, fly fisherman, and overall outdoorsman. There he is.
Hey!
We've both grown up exploring the backcountry of the East, and we hope to show you our perspective on the matter. Now, spending time in the outdoors isn't a new concept to us.
Experienced enough.
I've never whitewater rafted in my life.
Although the concept of this trip was completely new to us on every front. But before the adventure could start, we needed an idea.
Hey buddy, I have an idea.
Now that we had our idea, we knew we wanted to float, camp, and fish a river in the Northeast. In order to do all that, we needed gear and help. Lots of it. And with all this, we could learn the do's and the don'ts.
Probably not a great idea to attempt.
That make this the trip of a lifetime.
I've been looking down that long and lonely road that I travel just to make me a dime. I know my dimes are fine. I only hope that you're still mine. I've been looking down and counting all the hours till it's time to pick the flowers back home. It's been a long, long time, but baby, I sure hope you're mine. I've been looking down and counting up the minutes till it's time I should be coming back home. It's been a long, long time, and now I only hope you're mine. I've been looking down and thinking of you, baby. Well, I said goodbye to you long ago. It was so hard, I know, but baby, I just had to go. Roads and long, and times are long, when the nights are long and feeling strong. Oh, company to comfort me. Roads and long.
The planning for this trip started about a month before it actually happened. In retrospect, this seems like a lot of time to figure out the details. But for what we were trying to do, we needed a lot more time to come up with a plan.
David called me and said basically that he was on his way home from way out west. He wanted to cram in a trip this fall. And it was going to be a big, grand David trip. He thought I would be a good fit, I think, because I've fished with him before. I have experience backpacking. And that was kind of the whole idea, was we were going to live on the river and fly fish the whole way down it.
I wanna float like a bird, slow and low. I wanna follow the river wherever it goes. I want the wheels of time to jump the track. I wanna leave all my troubles and not look back.
The East offers a lot of the same outdoor experiences as the West. Now, I won't say that they're exactly alike, because they aren't. The West has landmarks and national parks that rival the most beautiful views on Earth. Incredible opportunities for fly fishing and spending any time in the outdoors. But if you break it down, there are a lot of similarities. You can go days without seeing another soul in the backcountry of the Linville Wilderness in North Carolina. The same goes for Cheeseman Canyon in Colorado. But there are a lot of key differences in how you explore these areas in the East and West. For example, in Colorado, a simple hike may have a better kept trail, but the risk of running into a grizzly or a mountain lion are high. Where in North Carolina, the risk of an animal attack is low, but the trails are narrow and extreme. At any point, you could risk the fall of hundreds of feet into the canyon. Each have their own methods of trying to get the best of you. For us, we grew up in the East, and our experiences in the outdoors were formed by our summers spent exploring the Adirondacks. That doesn't mean it was going to be any easier to plan this trip.
All right,
This is the first of a few planning sessions that we kind of have put together to plan our route and try to get brands on board. But it's pretty cool. I'm sitting right outside Addison's house. So we are going to kind of hop into like a strategy session and figuring out how we're going to make this happen. One of the first obstacles we found was that the East didn't have as many resources as the West when it came to planning a trip like this one. The reason for that was that not a lot of people had tried to do what we were going to do, and a whole lot less had actually written or documented their experiences while doing it. The big question in our minds at the beginning of all of this was whether or not we could experience the East in the same ways we experience the West. Can we float for days between mountain ranges as far as the eye can see? Can we fly fish out of pack rafts that hold everything we need to spend as much time in the outdoors as we can? I think for us, the short answer was yes. First, we got to work finding a river that had enough water to use rafts as our main method of travel. We needed there to be enough public land to plot our base camps, and finally, it had to hold trout.
On Google Maps, trying to, initially figure out or put in pull-out points, what's public land, what's not. And David was already in contact with Trout Routes. He hooked me up with an account, so that night I hopped on.
We were looking through the Trout Routes app, and I saw this giant gold streak. This river has all of the things that we kind of need in order to do this trip. There was not easy accessible camping spots alongside the Schroon. There was not easy put in, take out, and public parking spots on some of the other rivers. Rivers in the Northeast are traditionally walk and wade, meaning that you won't find a lot of people launching float boats like you might on the Yellowstone in Montana. But there are a couple rivers that shatter this stereotype. To find the perfect river, we needed to zero in on rivers with the highest flow rates and pinpoint areas of the float that would have the least portages.
I was looking around and noticed that public land lines most of this river, and then I was able to go in and look up, can you camp there? What are the rules and regulations? How far off the river do you have to be? Whatever. This river, it's deep pitted between a bunch of the Adirondack high peaks. You kind of just know, reading little things about it, that it's going to be one of the most beautiful places that you've ever visited. We were on the hunt for a perfect river. A lot of them were too bony, too technical, too dangerous, too slow, or even too warm for trout to survive. After days of research, we landed on an option that would weed out all the problems that most Adirondack lakes and their tributaries present. Our decision was made: the Sable River. The Sable River, a tributary connecting two famous lakes in the Adirondack region. Fed by Lake Placid, the west branch of the river has gained its fame from beautiful vistas at multiple lookout points throughout a patch of untouched state land. Some areas of the river include small pools with low flow areas for trout to hold in total peace as they travel upstream. Others boast 40-foot waterfalls and huge cliffs carved out of the mountainside, as a yearly estimated 91.5 billion cubic feet gallons of water flows 36 miles before running off into Lake Champlain. This area has some of the most beautiful and naturally preserved areas in the Adirondacks. The pull for anglers like us is a healthy and ideal ecosystem for the fish we anglers love to chase, and the food and water conditions that have kept the trout there for centuries. The opposition of erosion and road salts, dams, and pollution put all the trout and aquatic species in the system at risk. Because of this, an immense amount of work is being done by the community and conservation groups that call the area home. All of this effort is to help keep the river and the surrounding wilderness wild. Yo. We were a bit nervous of what we would find. The river in the area is beautiful, but has its fair share of danger. Like I mentioned before, there's 40-foot waterfalls, sections of a river that drop hundreds of feet in elevation, creating a minefield of rapids. We needed to prepare for the water we hoped to float, and we needed some help doing it. My buddy Aldo pointed me toward Brandon,
a local fly fishing and whitewater guide that specialized in the very river we hoped to float. We scheduled a few calls with him to talk about our idea.
I've run most of the East Branch in a canoe or paddle. The West Branch has definitely got some gnarly whitewater, and it can be a little, if you have some whitewater experience, it'll be fine. If you don't, it can be a little tricky. Yeah, the West Branch is pretty gnarly. There's some pretty nasty rapids. It is runnable at certain heights if you're brave enough. You definitely got to be on your A game. It can be kind of a bumpy grind in some spots just because there's literally only like one little channel for you to get through, and if you don't get through that channel, you're not going to have a fun time.
After the first phone call, we had our doubts that our selection would pan out at all. But the more that we talked to Brandon, the more promising the trip was looking. We hoped to float in fall. For this time of year, the water conditions were historically going to be lower. And through further conversation, we had to ask ourselves whether or not it was a good idea for two inexperienced rafters like ourselves to be taking on these pure-blooded Adirondack waters. But there was still so much unknown. Even an experienced guide like Brandon hadn't tried to spend days at a time on the Sable River. There are a few points in our route that raised some major concerns. The water conditions had to be just right for the trip to not only work, but avoid putting ourselves in some extremely dangerous situations.
Oh yeah, that pool below it in like low water, the New York State Police is retrieving somebody out of it that passed away. So it's like no joke.
Now that we dialed in the river and the route that would be home for a few days, how would we float? How would we sleep for days in the thick brush of the Adirondack River banks? What would we need to make this trip a reality? The next thing on the list was the gear. The general idea of the trip was kind of reliant on us partnering with a few companies because we didn't have boats, we didn't have the rods that we needed, we didn't have a lot of the gear that we needed, we didn't have life jackets or clothing that would prepare us for some of the like dips in temperatures that we were going to see in the fall in the mountains of the Adirondacks. One of the bigger things was having like boats. Like we didn't have boats.
David told me over the phone he saw these Cocopellis and he really wanted them. And I was like, how the heck are we going to keep all our stuff dry? Like on these boats, like we're going to have camera gear, we're going to have fishing gear. And I'm used to carrying 40 pounds on my back and we're going to do this whitewater rafting down a river and keeping it all together and safe. So I was looking in the Cocopellis and I realized that you could stuff stuff in the tubes of the Cocopellis to keep them dry. And I think that was a big moment where I was like, oh wait, he's onto something. This is a thing. You can backpack in a boat.
We kind of split out jobs as we started to plan this trip. Addison started to do some research on the rivers, and my job was kind of to secure the gear and make sure that we were able to have the tools needed to do this trip at all. I was able to kind of get in contact with a few companies that I thought would really line up with this and want to do it, and amazingly, they all said yes.
I mean, we had brand after brand after brand say yes, and David would call me every few days, be like, dude, guess what? So-and-so, they're sending us stuff already, whatever. And I'm just like, okay, I guess we're really doing this thing. When we were getting into, I guess, mechanics of the trip, we knew we had to spend a few nights out on the water. I'm familiar with the Adirondacks, and I knew how thick the East Coast can be. So I think David's initial plan was we'll bring a tent, we'll both bring our sleeping bags. But over the past few years, I switched from tent camping to hammock camping because personally I felt it to be way more comfortable. And also if you're not staying on designated pine needle bed campsites, you can't find a place to put a tent. That's where my backpacking gear really came into the play. We just kind of used a bunch of what I had as a base, and David needed a couple extra things, but we ended up using hammocks the entire time. The day that we actually began packing, the yard looked like an explosion. I was already used to packing an 85-liter backpack. David is used to packing a van.
I have never packed for a trip exactly like this one. I kind of went into it with the mindset of like, yeah, I own a bunch of lightweight stuff, so I'll bring all of that lightweight stuff. We got all this equipment, we had the Cocopellis, we had these shipments from Topo, we had Reddington stuff, we had Patagonia stuff, but I had no idea what I was doing.
I did begin just ripping stuff out of David's bag and his boat, and it was really fun to watch David like really decide whether or not he needed this thing or that thing to survive, really. That's what it came down to.
So we need to test the boats and flip them in some like actual water. And I flipped kayaks before and tried to get them back over and done a bunch of like bail procedures just to make sure that you can get back in the boat if you have to. So I'm gonna take it to a local spot here and we're gonna see how they roll and what it feels like to try to get them back over in the water.
The plan was this: to float a 20-mile segment on the west branch of the Sable River, guide ourselves using insight from the Trout Routes database, local maps, and resources from the Hungry Trout, and to fish, float, and camp for multiple days. We made the 5-hour drive to the town of Willmington, New York, where we would spend the day and run through the plan in person. We drove the length of our float, stopping at each section of the river we could see from the road. A lot of people ask me how we plan for a trip with as many details as this one. And the truth is, the tools can get you pretty far. But talking to an outfit or a fly shop on the river that you're targeting is going to be your most valuable asset. And that's exactly what we did. The plan was to go to the Hungry Trout, grab the remaining amount of supplies that we needed, and chat with Evan about our plan for the following day.
Hey, how are you?
So we went into the Hungry Trout the day we got to town, and they were super helpful. They had a map that ran along the top of their fly shop. We were telling them where we were thinking about putting in and where we were gonna take out. And they instantly said that you can float this section, but this section is minefield of rocks. And when we drove by it, yeah, it looked like there might not have been water there. It was hard to hear, but I'm glad they told us.
So we ran into a little bit of a hiccup. The plan was to float a pretty high mileage portion of the river. We talked with Evan at the Hungry Trout and he helped us out a ton. He's floated these rivers 1,000 times. Brandon Seifert from the Hungry Trout has floated these rivers 1,000 times. But unfortunately, the last couple of days, we've needed a big push in like water levels. These guys really know the water, and they were telling us a certain portion where once it gets too low, it not only gets too low to float, but it also gets a little bit dangerous.
There was a part of me that wanted to float on. We came all of this way, and in my mind, that was a good reason to block out the experienced voice of reason. Things like this happen all the time, and plans change. But as outdoorsmen and anglers, we have to adapt in order to make room for the actual adventure to begin.
The good thing is, though, that just means we can fish a lot more. It's a really nice brown. Oh my gosh. It's a really nice brown. He was so picky.
After a month of non-stop thinking about the trip and the details around it, it was finally here. The plan for day one was simple. Get the vehicles staged at the put in and pull out spots. Do a final pack of the rafts and get to base camp number 1.
Hey buddy, what's up?
We eventually got everything stocked up. I got my camera gear, I got my boat pumped up, I got my waders on.
So NRS accidentally made a pretty compatible fly fishing and kayaking life jacket here, because we got our fly boxes that can fit straight in here, and then we rigged these out last night. We got nippers, we got a tippet, we got a bunch of different stuff, and it kind of just holds the essentials so that we can get out and fish a lot more than just like taking bags off, packs off, getting out of our like raft stuff and throwing on different gear, so that makes it nice.
And then we were able to start off. Day 1 was the biggest section of water we had to cover. There wasn't a lot of elevation change, and mostly private land lined the bank on either side. So we would push through, stopping to fish the least out of our 3 days. We started that first portion of the trip, which, just like the guide said at the Hungry Trout, was going to be a little bit of a slower section. So we're able to see from a distance, like, we probably won't need to cast to that. We probably won't need to cast to that. Until we came around this one little like horseshoe shape in the river. And so I was getting a couple of like nibbles, and I was like, Addison, there's fish in here. The second that he started like ripping his streamer through, all of a sudden we're seeing flashes under the water, and I'm seeing like white bellies. I'm like, I think these are brookies. Addison hooks into a fish, and he's like, oh, I've got one on. And I think this is where like it like kind of turned on for us. We continued to fish that spot for a little while. Addison got in a few more beautiful little brookies. For the rest of the day, we saw a couple of good pockets of water, but again, it was that really, really slow water. We were really just kind of in this long home stretch to camp, which puts us just on the border of public land, and then we knew that we could kind of slow down and start to look for our camp for the night. We had just crossed the threshold into public land. We got out of the boats, and I saw one trout rising. And so I was sitting there and I was like, okay, I've had this hopper dropper on all day long. I'm gonna make this thing eat a dry fly. So I tossed the thing out there. I mend the line one time and I see this riffle, like she had eaten the copper john underneath. Eventually from there we had kind of worked our way down the river system. We got into a spot where we were like, oh yeah, this would be pretty nice. Like, let's pull off and check a couple of these spots.
There's just not many clear. I mean, this is kind of clearing. Okay. Yeah.
I didn't find anything less terrifying.
Just the middle of the woods. Oh. All right, well, we're looking for a spot for the night. Oh. And I guess when we find one, we'll tell you. We ran into hordes of mosquitoes. We had to throw like our buffs up over our head, and even through the buffs we were getting bit, through our shirts we were getting bit.
We paddled for as long as the bugs were out. It was starting to get dark quick. That was amazing. Nice dry rocks. We pulled off, set up camp real quick, and started fishing, obviously. Last night, as it was getting dark, we kind of made our fire and we were hanging out. I was kind of sipping my hot chocolate and enjoying sitting down. But David was like, hey man, we gotta go night fishing. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, since they can't see in the dark, their lateral lines turn on. That's why like mousing's a thing.
They can kind of feel the water moving around them and they'll just nip at it. It's just like a reactionary thing. I mean, I can tell them all of this knowledge that I've learned. It doesn't mean I'm gonna make them catch a fish.
Just kind of dead drifting them through this current behind me. We were dodging the tree the best we could because we couldn't see anything. And I just watched David fish for like 10 minutes. Had a couple bumps and then he gave me his spot. And I was like, I need to give it a try, but I got a bite.
Oh my gosh, you almost threw off the net.
I'm just gonna drop it.
Go ahead. Oh my goodness. The night catch. Dude, that's sick.
Fish at night.
That's fantastic.
Man.
I don't even know what was happening. All I felt was tugging. I didn't even really have to set the hook. I kind of just like, I guess I set the hook.
We just did a full day of floating. We caught fish. Like, we were freaking doing what we came here to do. A really cool first night. Waking up on day 2, we were optimistic after Addison's success fishing the night before. We woke up to crisp Adirondack air. Today was the day that we knew we faced our largest portage. We checked the satellite and our route to our next base camp. We knew we could take our time today, stopping to fish with a lot more freedom. That day, we knew that we had to, first of all, get to our other camp, which was miles and miles away. And in between that, we had to do the biggest portage later on in the day at Quarry Pool. We made our first little trek out. We stopped and fished at a bunch of places. We saw a bunch of fish move, but we didn't get into anything initially. So we encountered all these different like cool little pieces of water, and it was just fun to fish it in general. But then we started to get kind of midday, which is usually when you'd assume that it would start to slow down, when I started to see some more rises in the slow water. So I cast way in front of it because I didn't want to spook it mainly. which was kind of like that East Coast mentality kind of going into my brain where I didn't want to slap a fly down on the surface. I kind of wanted to throw it way up and just kind of mend my line, make sure that everything was floating the way that it needed to float. And then it kind of happened all at once.
Let's go.
This is Corey Pool, and there is no way we can float this. We'll fish it though.
So we kind of have a plan to work around this. We knew we were gonna portage this section.
Everything that we had in the boat, basically, we had to take down the river. And then we had to come back one by one. And this was like probably a 10-minute walk each way. Then we had to do one boat at a time. So I grabbed the front, he'd grab the back.
Here are gonna be a little tough to squeeze the boats through, so we just have to make them as transportable as possible. And right now, Addison's is pretty dang close. Mine is not.
It wasn't fun. I wouldn't say it was fun.
Slipping down everything. So just made it more difficult. It was not as bad as it could have been, but it wasn't great.
After we got done with the portage, we started fishing a little bit. And like the water was super fishy. Gotten a couple more fish. And we were kind of pushing for time. Like we were only able to fish for 45 minutes before we had to keep going to our next campsite.
Oh.
Bad trail. A little skinny. I don't know the best route.
I think it's to stand up and walk.
Okay, let's do it.
Just careful of your ankles and stuff. We're getting here to our last spot. It's our second campsite along the route that we kind of plotted with Evan and Brandon from the Hungry Trout. And it was a super good day. Addison and I both got on some fish. We were able to do our major portage, which was crazy. It was quite a freaking walk. When we're done, we're through. Addison got onto some more fish this evening throughout Corey Pool, which was sick. And now we're headed to camp, post up for the night, relax, dry off. Two full-size trees in the middle of our path. Portage 2.
Portage 2.
Portage 2 before dinner.
Right here at camp too. Like the other side of this tree is a camp.
This is pre-dinner portage.
Yeah, because you gotta get your blood going.
We head out to our second campsite, which ended up being super sick. It had a view of Whiteface. It was beautiful. Like we ended up finally finding it just before dark, and there's like a hatch going on.
I'll give it the freaking rise.
We like yank our boats up. We pull out all our stuff and we jump back in the water. And we're fishing like, again, this is now just past sunset. Before we even set up our camp stuff, we're like, let's fish this hatch, right? And we had to try everything in the box. I don't think we landed a fish in that spot. And they were so unpredictable. Like fish were popping up all around us, like right in front of us. We're like, what's going on? After we didn't catch anything that night, we ended up building a little fire. David pulled out the cinema camera that we were shooting on for this trip. It was very run and gun. You know, he gave me like a little run through and I was taking some shots on the cinema camera and I didn't know how they looked. But when we were sitting around the campfire and he pulled out the camera with the nice monitor on it, we started replaying some of the footage and some of these shots. I was like, this is gonna be so cool. So that was like a huge morale boost, was, you know, seeing some of why we were doing this was to capture it and show you guys.
Day 3. This was the home stretch. Waking up, we had a couple goals in mind. Catch more fish and get back to the van. Days of paddling can wear down even the most in-shape outdoorsman, which neither of us claimed to be. We ate some breakfast, made some coffee, and launched the rafts. We'd hoped to meet up with Brandon for a section of our float, but his schedule didn't allow until the day that we got back to the pullout. We talked to Brandon, and he knew that we hadn't had much luck running rapids in the rafts, which in all honesty, we were both terrified to do. If something went wrong, we didn't have the experience to get ourselves out of a bad situation, so we decided to play it safe and portage the sections we weren't comfortable with.
With these fully loaded with stuff, it's probably not a great idea to attempt, because if you look at the top over here, there's a section just off the top that's really, really low. It just immediately hits a rock and then dumps into this pool. So we can, though, portage the boats a little bit, and I'll get in at the end and run the rest of it. So we're gonna try that.
The reason why we wanted to run it so bad is because we'd gotten these rafts that could handle it. And I really wanted to use them for what they were used for. But there also comes a time of like kind of being able to discern whether or not like it's a smart decision to try to rack 80 pounds of gear that's in the inner tube of the boat over a wickedly like bony section. So we brought it underneath, and Addison and I still had like a blast like running this smaller section, even though it like wasn't the most insane amazing thing ever. It was still fun for us to like run some faster water. Slowly made our way back to the van. We saw the van, and like I think this like sigh of relief went over us because we were like, we did it. We're done. Like we did the trip that we just came here to do.
We're done. That's the trip. Brandon's meeting up with us, and he's got some secrets up his sleeve, so he says. So we're gonna find out what that means.
Once we met up with Brandon, he mentioned that he knew of a place that we could fish and float some rapids under the eye of an experienced whitewater instructor. We packed the rafts and our gear into the van and followed Brandon deeper into the Adirondack wilderness.
He brought his Old Town canoe, and we had our Coco Pellies. We ditched a lot of our gear. We still had the camera stuff. We still had the Remington stuff. So we put together, I put together the Predator, which I began to love over the trip, is streamer fishing.
This presented a new adventure altogether. This was the icing on the cake for a trip that we had spent months planning. We came, filmed our story, the parts that we had planned, and a lot that we didn't account for. We came up with this project with the intention of documenting an adventure on our home turf, showing the similarities between the East and the West, but ended up diving deeper into some of the country's most prized and loved trout waters, taking a closer look into the efforts that so many people put forth to help this river and so many like it thrive as the world around it changes. I think that our point of view remains. As anglers, we sometimes think that we have to travel incredible distances to experience fly fishing in the purest form. While I think this is a way to expand our experience and drive for adventure that we all have, I also believe that this can be found wherever you find yourself immersed in the outdoors and the love for the sport. In the very making of this film, we spent all of our time thinking about this river, posing questions like, what was it like 100 years ago when native species swarmed these rivers? And what will the river look like in 100 years from now, as so much of our society opposes the basic survival of river systems like these? Overall, I'm glad we could experience this river how it exists today, in our time. And taking a step back, regardless of the location, we can continue to build on the work being done that ensures that rivers and trips like this one are around for our children and their children to experience, whether it's the Wild West or the wilds of the East.